In our time, imagination and images play an important role, be it in coaching sessions where people visualize their future success, in therapies and studies that use a placebo effect, or in the form of Tibetan Buddhism that instructs its followers to imagine that they are already enlightened until they actually become enlightened. This more positive side of imagination contrasts with its darker side. Horrific images of war and suffering can increase depression, and just as a placebo effect, there's also a nocebo effect. In a sense, images and imagination shape our reality, not least by exploiting our emotions. This also makes them particularly dangerous and suitable for manipulation by propaganda and AI-generated images. Imagination also played an important role in the 16th and 17th centuries, and there was a broad discourse on this phenomenon in which numerous scholars participated. The word phantasia and its Latin translation imaginatio can be traced back to Aristotle, who used it to describe a faculty of the human soul that stores sensory impressions and can combine them freely. So what it basically is, you perceive something through your senses. For example, you see something, and that is then, this impression is then stored inside the phantasia and can then be recombined with other sensory impressions. The discourse on phantasia in the 16th and century was characterized by two big questions that could also apply to our time. The first one concerns the power of phantasia. What can it do? What influence does it have on the human body? For example, there were scholars who explained the placebo effect with the help of imaginatio. Radical scholars, such as Paracelsus, for example, even believed that it was possible to influence other people's bodies with the help of one's own imaginatio. In other words, its power was judged quite differently. The second question concerns the reliability of the imaginatio. How reliably does it represent the world? Can imagined images or phantasmata, how Aristotle calls them, always be distinguished from real sensory impressions? How easily can imaginatio be manipulated from the outside, especially by the devil? What role does a distorted imaginatio play in mental illnesses such as melancholy? Today, we will focus on the second set of questions, the reliability of phantasmata or imaginations. And in this context, we will turn our attention to the medical faculty of the University of Wittenberg, where the imaginatio was frequently and intensively discussed. Not only do we find 3 disputations and 1 speech devoted specifically to this phenomenon, but the discourse on the imaginatio also played a role in many other discourses, especially those concerning mental illness and supernatural phenomena such as witchcraft. In this lecture, we would like to examine this reception through 2 main questions. First, what were the conditions of reception? Second, how was the reception? As you can see, the structure of the lecture is based on these 2 main questions. In the first main section, we want to look at 3 conditions which, in my opinion, are particularly relevant for the reception of the phantasia in Wittenberg. First, Wittenberg anatomy. What understanding of the human body prevailed in Wittenberg, and to what extent did it facilitate the reception of the concept of imaginatio? Second, we will look at Aristotle's concept of phantasia, which was still very important to many Wittenberg scholars who argued in an Aristotelian way on this topic. It was also the basis for comparable early modern concepts. Finally, we will examine the extent to which contemporary demonology influenced the concept of the imaginatio. In the second part, we will then look at the way the concept was received through a concrete example, namely another smaller discourse in which imaginatio played a crucial role. This is the phenomenon of ecstasy. Put simply, it is a phenomenon in which the person concerned, lies motionless for hours, and when he or she wakes up, reports how his mind has traveled through the area and visited distant places. This part can be divided into two parts. In the first part, we will examine whether a separation of body and soul was even considered possible in Wittenberg, and in the second part, we will look at the reception of the imaginatio within the discourse on ecstasies. So let's start with the condition for the reception of the imaginatio concepts, and more specifically with the condition at the University of Wittenberg and its medical faculty. Here we want to answer the question of whether there were any factors that favored the reception and intensive study of the imaginatio. The central questions here seems to be how the human body and its relationship to the soul were conceived. That means we want to consider whether Wittenberg, as a Protestant university, had a specific relationship to anatomy and physiology. Vivian Nutten, Jürgen Helm, and Andrew Cunningham have already explored this question. I will briefly summarize the part of their finding that is relevant for our purposes. The basic view of the relationship between the human being and the soul was the same at Catholic and Protestant universities. Anatomy was considered a part of natural philosophy, which described nature as it was created by God. Anyone who dissected a body, it was believed, was looking directly into the venerable creation of God, and the body was seen as an instrument of the soul. One difference was that in Wittenberg it was more strongly emphasized that the purposefully created human body simultaneously showed the providence of God and the fragility of human life. The main difference, however, was that anatomy was not first taught at the medical faculty, but was already part of the regular artist course. This meant that every Wittenberg student had to study anatomy. The idea behind this innovation was that anatomical knowledge was necessary to understand the human soul. These university reforms can be traced to Philip Melanchthon, we see him on the slide, who also published his Commentarius de Anima in 1540, in which he explicitly combined Galen's human anatomy with Aristotle's theory of the soul. Melanchthon's book became an important textbook in the following decades and was the subject of many lectures. In it, he adopted Aristotle's philomorphic premise that the human soul, which is a form for the matter of the body, can be recognized only by the actions it performs. Melanchthon also merged Galen's doctrine of the spirits with the Holy Spirit. So the idea was that there are certain spirits in the human body, and after the fall of man, they become in unorder. And in the moment you become the Holy Spirit gets into you, these unordered spirits get in order again, and you have a clearer view on God and nature. It was also crucial to Melanchthon in his Commentarius de Anima repeatedly derived rules from the anatomy of the body for dealing with human afflictions, and above all with one's own emotions. The goal was therefore to gain control over one's own body, over mental effects, and not least to lead an ethically good life. What can we deduce from this for the reception of imaginatio concepts? In general, it can be assumed that the intensive study of the relationship between body and mind, which already took place in the artist course, probably increased the willingness to deal with psychosomatic phenomena, especially since the Aristotelian approach of deducing the soul's essence from its actions was strongly emphasized by Melanchthon. Finally, the desire to gain control over the effects through anatomical knowledge reflects an understanding of the body that is characterized by an awareness of its own fragility, and that assumes that there are processes in the body that can influence our behavior and minds. But we can control them if we understand their anatomical causes. This understanding of the body is in principle compatible with the idea that there are deceptive phantasms that can influence our thoughts and actions. None of these are hard factors that in, excuse me, I have to take a sip of tea. Okay. None of these are hard factors that in themselves explain why certain ideas of imaginatio were or were not accepted, but they are factors that may have favored the acceptance of certain ideas. We will come back to this point. Having hinted at the importance of Aristotle for Wittenberg anatomy, let us now turn to the imaginatio itself and see how he treats the phenomenon. Indeed, Aristotle is still relevant to many scholars who dealt with the imaginatio in the 16th and 17th century. He thus stands at the beginning of a tradition that we cannot understand without knowing his concept of imaginatio. In the third book of De Anima, Aristotle explains what he means by phantasia. The interpretation of this chapter and of the whole work is still controversial. There are several reasons for this. The subject matter is complex and full of presuppositions. The work seems to lack the final editing. There are text critical and linguistic problems, and much is only briefly presented. These ambiguities allow and have allowed different interpretations and also adaptations of Aristotle's teachings to other systems, to which we will return later. However, before we can clarify what Aristotle means by phantasia, we must clarify his understanding of perception, or ecstasy, as the two conceptions are closely related for him. Basically, perception is one of four faculties of the soul that are inherent to the human being. As a faculty or dynamis, perception is, so to speak, constantly in a kind of state of readiness and then becomes reality or energeia when it actually does what corresponds to its purpose, namely to perceive something. Our perception, for example, is always ready and able to perceive a sound and only becomes real when it actually hears it. The five human senses play a rather passive role in that it is the objects of perceptions that affect them through a medium. For example, the sound of an object can move the medium of air in such a way as to affect the sense of hearing. The faculty of perception is equal in capacity to its objects of perception. But only when it is affected by an object does its quality become equal to the object in reality. Therefore, the faculty of perception is constantly oriented towards being equal to all things in the world, and it only fulfills this inherent purpose when it is affected by an external object. This is not to be understood in the sense that the faculty of perception assimilates itself to the perceived object. Rather, it assumes a reality that is already inherent in it and that also corresponds to the perceived object. Aristotle also distinguishes the types of perception depending on the nature of the objects of perception and the degree of certainty with which they represent reality. Peculiar, common, and accidental objects of perception. Firstly, peculiar perception, or idea aestheta. This is the most reliable type of perception, since an object of perception only affects a single sense. Because of its causal effect on one sense, the object of perception generally corresponds perfectly to the nature of the perceptual faculty. Common objects of perception, or koina aestheta, are things like motion, rest, number, and extension. They are not specific to one sense, but affect at least two senses at the same time. And that means, for example, you can see and hear movement. Here too, the ability to perceive corresponds to the reality of the object of perception, but perception is less reliable than in the case of peculiar objects of perception. Finally, there are accidental objects of perception, or katasymbabekos aestheta. Aristotle gives the example of taking something white that you see to be the sun of the Ares. We thus associate something that we perceive with something else. So we see something white, and then we think, oh, because we have a certain memory, this must be the sun of the Ares. Perception here is therefore not causally influenced by the object of perception, as is the case with peculiar and common objects of perception, and therefore doesn't represent its reality. Errors are most likely to occur here. The faculty of phantasia now stores past perceptions, recalls them, and combines them with each other. This means that the images created by phantasia depend on the reliability of the perceptions. In other words, the three gradations of perception also influence the images of phantasmata of our phantasia. Aristotle repeatedly emphasizes how unreliable phantasia is compared to perception, by which he probably simply means that phantasia no longer presents reality, whereas perception usually does. And usually humans can distinguish between phantasia and perception. So they will not, for example, feel afraid just because they are imagining something bad. When a person is ill or drunk, however, the distinction between phantasia and perception can be more difficult. But phantasia is not just a purely mental phenomenon. Aristotle describes it as a movement. And by that he means that this is change caused by perception that is stored in the body. Phantasmata or imaginary contents are, one might say, physical representations of past perceptions. And these phantasmata are used by the intellect. That means that thinking takes place in images or phantasmata, and these phantasmata connect perception and thinking. So for Aristotle, thinking depends indirectly on the perception of nature, where perception is in principle capable of representing all things in nature, and phantasia of combining them with each other. Everything thinkable thus depends on perception. What does this mean for the perception of the concept of phantasia in the early modern period? In general, the complexity and openness of the text allowed for different interpretations or combinations with other concepts. For example, the fact that Aristotle repeatedly speaks of the unreliability of phantasia allowed scholars and physicians of the early modern period to use it as an explanatory model of imagination, self-deception, and borderline mental states. Especially since Aristotle himself writes that illness and the influence of alcohol could have an impact on the content of the imaginatio. Another thing is crucial. For Aristotle, as for all Christian recipients, the soul was incorporeal, divine, and therefore independent of material influence. Phantasmata, however, are a kind of physical representation, and in Galen, the phantasia itself has been regarded as a physical organ located in the ventricles of the brain. Mental disorders could therefore be explained as disorders of the phantasia, which accidentally affected the human intellect. Thinking therefore suffers because it works with the help of imaginary contents that are damaged. Daniel Sennert, for example, writes that disorders of the mind are almost always accompanied by a disorder of phantasia. This brings us to the next point. The reception of the discourse on phantasia also coincided with a period in which eschatological ideas about the arrival or presence of the Antichrist were on the rise. Witchcraft, devils, and demons increasingly became the focus of interest, as their activity could be interpreted as a sign of the apocalypse. Accordingly, prominent contemporary scholars reported an increase in demonic activity and interpreted this as a sign of the end of the world. In Protestantism, it was Martin Luther who equated the papacy with the Antichrist, and thus contributed to the spread of eschatology. Sorry, I have to take another sip of tea. In Protestantism, it was Martin Luther who equated the papacy with the Antichrist and thus contributed to the spread of eschatological ideas. But scholars such as Johann Bayer and Andreas Kellichius also believed in an imminent end of time and associated it with demons. The growing interest in demons also spread to less scholarly circles, as evidenced by the growth of German language devil literature in the second half of the 16th century, especially by Gnesiolutherans. Not only did demons seem almost omnipresent to 16th century people, but they were also believed to have great powers, including the ability to move with superhuman speed and to influence the weather, as well as superhuman cunning and an excellent knowledge of nature. Yet it was by no means the case that there were no limits to their abilities. On the contrary, the dualistic idea that demons had abilities comparable to those of God would have been difficult to reconcile with religious beliefs of the time. In the words of Thomas Aquinas, demons could do amazing things, he calls them mira, whereas only God could do real miracles or miracula. For example, some scholars believe that unlike God, demons did not have perfect knowledge of the future and could not create something out of nothing. Rather, as Stuart Clark has pointed out in a monograph on early modern demonology, for the majority of contemporary scholars, demons were bound by the limits of nature. Nevertheless, it was believed that demons had much deeper knowledge than humans and could therefore do things that might seem supernatural from human perspective. Most of all, demons are still excellent deceivers. They cannot perform real miracles, but they can fake them very well. They can influence people's senses and imaginations and make them see things that are not there. From a contemporary point of view, the assumption of a disturbed imaginatio must have been a flexible and very suitable instrument for explaining mental phenomena that seemed supernatural, because the imaginatio could influence thinking without the need to assume a direct influence on the divine intellect. This was necessary because, from an Aristotelian point of view, the soul is the form or substance of the body and can only be affected accidentally. So you cannot directly affect something that is divine. From a Christian point of view, the soul was immortal and divine, and the idea that demons could have a direct effect on it was therefore highly problematic. Phantasmata, however, could be influenced, whether by processes in one's own body because someone is melancholic, or by demons. And thinking could then also be influenced by them, since it depends on the contents of the phantasmata. You can think of this as a kind of three possibilities to define the limits of nature. So we have something which would be secundum naturam, or something that is natural. For example, if an old man, a very old man, is impotent, this is kind of natural. Then you would say this is secundum naturam. Praeter is something that is against the unordinary course of nature. I think I don't know if this term is anachronistic. It seems to become more common during the 17th century, but I can use it anyway to describe what I mean. So a praeter would be something against the ordinary course of nature. For example, if a young man becomes impotent, then you could say, okay, maybe there's a demon involved. Or if you spit out needles. And contra naturam would be something that cannot be done at all, perhaps by God, for example, to separate the soul from the body. Okay. Although this view was widespread among scholars, this does not mean that the subject of demonology was not controversial. Of course, How narrowly one defined the boundaries of the nature was crucial, and there were differences. And there was at least one opponent of this theory, namely Jean Baudin, who conceded that the devil could act against the order of nature and go beyond its limit. But with the caveat that these supernatural abilities were granted to him by God. For example, he considered soul travel and the separation of body and soul to be quite possible, whereas most of the Wittenberg scholars, as we shall see, excluded this possibility altogether. The question of the limits of nature is related to the question of the ability of demons to deceive. If phenomena such as ecstasies cannot be reconciled with the workings of nature, then they must be deception, hallucination, or illusions. Roughly speaking, the less power one attributes to a demon, the more willing one is to dismiss phenomena as demonic deceptions and the influence of phantasia. But again, there are gradations. Can a demon's arbitrarily cause hallucinatory states in any person? Or are there people who are particularly susceptible because they are sinners or suffer from some form of melancholy? Or are demons perhaps no longer necessary to explain phenomena such as ecstasies because they can be explained by a form of melancholy? And if you assume that demons can influence the perception of reality, what can then be verified or falsified? To sum up, it is crucial how one defines the boundaries of nature. In the following, we will look at how the boundaries were set in the discourse on the phenomenon of ecstasies in Wittenberg. I have chosen this discourse because it is manageable and is ideal, because it's a small discourse. It fits very well into this lecture. Here you can see the text I have used. I will not go through all the authors and titles. Whenever I refer to one, you can have a look at this slide. We have that ecstasis is a phenomenon in which a person lies motionless for hours, and when he wakes up, reports how his mind has traveled and visited distant places. For contemporary scholars, the question was whether the soul could be naturally separated from the body at all. We will therefore look at the philosophical and theological positions on this issue. Since Aristotle's philosophy was a central point of reference in any discussion of natural philosophy in Wittenberg, we will begin with a brief consideration of Aristotle's statements on the relationship between body and soul. According to Aristotle, the soul is entelechy, or realization or completion of the potentially living body. It is, so to speak, the life-giving principle and form for the matter of the body. Any early modern scholar who adopted Aristotle's doctrine of the soul had to assume a close connection between soul and body. To separate the soul as the life-giving principle from the body would inevitably lead to the death of the body. Andreas Schatto, for example, writes, "Another striking proof of the difference between body and soul is that the body by its nature does nothing, feels nothing, and is not alive unless the soul enclosed in it allows it to make use of these things. For it is the soul that lives, feels, discriminates and judges, remembers, directs and moves the body. It is placed over it as its master and ruler. If it leaves it, there is no feeling and no life in the body." If one were to assume that the soul actually leaves the body during ecstasis, then one would have to assume that the body is dead and will be revived when the soul returns, which would also have theological implications. Martin Beeman, for example, writes, "But is the body of a person whose spirit has departed alive or dead? If it is alive, how can it be filled with life if it has no life-giving principle? And if we assume that is dead, what prevents the dead from being resurrected, since their body has also left, since their soul has also left their body?" I have to take another sip again. It is clear then that in the context of Aristotle's philosophy, a separation between body and soul is unthinkable. But how was the relationship between body and soul discussed in Protestantism? In general, as Markus Friedrich showed in an article he published 2009, most Protestants, like Aristotle, assumed a close connection between body and soul. There was also broad agreement that the soul was dependent on the body and its organs, as Johannes Nell, for example, emphasized. But even here were graduations. Shato, for example, argued that man was actually created as a unity of soul and body, but that after the fall, God, out of mercy, gave the soul certain abilities so that it could perform certain spiritual activities, like understanding, remembering, and feeling, even without a body. Shato does not write, one might add, that the soul retained the ability to move. Rudolf Gosling, on the other hand, emphasized that the soul could continue to exist without a body, but could not act. It was generally assumed that the unity of body and soul continued to play a role after death. After all, it was agreed that the human being would resurrect physically. The question of whether the human soul was capable of acting in the meantime could be answered in different ways. Luther and Taurellus, for example, thought that the soul or the whole person was dozing in a kind of sleep, a thesis that Johannes Quenstedt or Egidius Hunius contradicted. Traditionally, the idea was that the soul of the deceased would see God immediately, but the body, after the bodily resurrection, would contribute at least accidentally to the knowledge of God. What conclusions can be drawn from these findings? First of all, it can generally be said that because of the assumed close relationship between body and soul, a separation of the two could be considered unnatural and unlikely. But even if one were to disregard these reservations, one would still have to ask to what extent the soul can act at all, and not simply, like the souls of the deceased, either fall into sleep or see God. And even if one did not assume both, the problem mentioned by Martin Biermann remained, namely that the dead, unlike the ecstatics, could not rise again. For most Protestants, therefore, the idea of a soul's journey was problematic, and so ecstasis had to be presented as impossible or explained in some other way. But how was the separability of body and soul treated in the discourse on ecstasis itself? Here too seems to have been broad agreement that no separation of body and soul can take place during an ecstasis. Kaspar Polker, for example, writes that God may have separated the souls of the prophets from their bodies, transferred them to heaven, and eventually reunited them with their bodies. The devil, on the other hand, is not capable of such a feat. Polker thus emphasizes the close and indissoluble connection between soul and body. He argues that the miracle of God's creation allows no separation. Hieronymus Neumann, who adopts Polker's definition of ecstasis, also considers it impossible that a separation between soul and body could be brought about naturally or by the devil. For him, reports of ecstasis can be explained by a disturbance of the imaginatio due to melancholy or the influence of the devil. Martin Biermann also denies the possibility of the body leaving the soul. We have already heard him compare the separation of the soul from the body to death. So how could the body continue to live without a life-giving principle? He adds that the only potentia that could be attributed to the body of an ecstatic person as opposed to a corpse and that would be capable of receiving the soul is the calor innatus. By that he probably means the warmth of life that resides in the heart. But this is completely unthinkable because the warmth of life cannot last for a moment if the soul as a life-giving principle has left the body. Moreover, the calor depends on breathing and pulse, which are generated only by the soul. Another line of argument he uses concerns the function of body and soul. It cannot be, he writes, that soul and body are at the same time substances, or you could say forms. For how could two independently existing substances be connected? Biermann argues, so it can be summarized purely in terms of Aristotelian philosophy, and considers the possibility of a separation between body and soul to be absurd. His arguments are taken up almost unchanged by Heinrich Innichenhofer. According to Innichenhofer, a complete separation of soul and body can only be brought about by God himself. Daniel Zenner doesn't want to comment on whether the soul is separated and is separated. He simply says that this is not the place, that his textbook is not the place to discuss these things. We have seen that in Wittenberg, for theological and natural reasons, it was generally assumed that a separation between body and soul was not possible only through God. It made sense, therefore, to explain this phenomenon as an illusion caused by a distorted imaginatio. Let us now look together at how exactly this was done. Let us first turn to Caspar Peucker. In his Commentarius de Praecipius Divinationum Generibus, he also presents the widespread medical theory of the causes of ecstasy, which attributes it to a form of melancholy. But this is not the natural melancholy of a person with the right temperament. That means ratio of humors, but a pathological melancholy caused by the noxious substance of a burnt juice. Such melancholy can be caused by the combustion of black or yellow bile or blood. Peucker describes the process as follows. Because of the quantity and intensity of the melancholy juice, which spreads into the body and affects the brain and the spirits, their temperament also changes. The soul withdraws into itself. Its connections with the body loosens, only the brain remains connected to it. The reason for this is that the brain is so strongly stimulated by the changes that it produces seemingly real images and causes the soul to neglect its normal activities. The nature of the images produced correspond to the nature of the melancholic humor. For example, if it consists of burnt blood, one has cheerful visions. But if it consists of burnt yellow bile, one sees terrible images of torture or executions. For Peucker, this purely medical explanation is not enough. The fact that the visions of the ecstatic seem so convincing, plausible, and genuine suggests the influence of demons, especially since their bodies would suffocate if the subtle bodies of the demons did not keep the heart alive with gentle, cool air currents, thus creating a substitute for breathing. In most cases, however, according to Peucker, it is not only demons that cause ecstasies, but rather a form of melancholy that is used or supported by demons. Peucker thus generally assumes a combination of natural causes, that means illness, and the work of the devil, who uses and intensifies existing processes in the body. On the whole, Peucker's approach is relatively typical for his time, in that he ties the devil to the limit of nature. At the same time, he takes the extraordinary, that means the breaking of the usual course of nature, that means the coherence of the vision that are produced, as proof of the devil's work. Again, this is not unusual, for although many 16th century scholars looked for natural causes, hardly any one of them categorically excluded the influence of the devil. Peucker does not offer an explicit theory of phantasia or imaginatio. His remarks are simply too brief and unspecific for that. But in the following years, imaginatio would increasingly come into focus and be discussed more systematically in Wittenberg. A decisive role in this was played by Johann Weyer, who in his work De Prestigiis Daemonum not only developed a demonology, but also commented extensively on phantasia. The work is best known for the image of the witch it presents. Weyer denies that witches have any magical or supernatural power, and portrays them as poor old women whose age and complexion makes them particularly susceptible to the devil's deceptions. For him, witches are victims, not perpetrators, because their abilities are based solely on imaginatio. He explicitly compared these imaged magical phenomena and reports, such as attendances at the witches' sabbath, to the phenomenon of ecstasis. For Weyer, demons were at the service of God's creation. They were there to test people. Demons can make the human imaginatio see any shapes and colors they want. And in the contemporary view, the godless and the melancholy were particularly susceptible to this manipulation, as were women and the elderly. For Weyer, man lives in a world of deceptive appearances, whereas for Aristotle, the imaginatio normally depicted the world relatively reliably. For Weyer, it is a source of false ideas. Man must constantly reckon with being deceived and tested. Weyer's work aims to make people aware of the unreliability of their imaginatio and to encourage them to question appearances critically. In principle, this is also compatible with the Wittenberg anatomy concept and view of humanity, in which the fragile human being must be aware of his or her fragility and strive for mental and physical health. A few years later, Jean Baudin published De Magorum der Monomania and added an appendix in which he opposed Weyer's view that witches were merely victims who should not be punished. The appendix is characterized by fierce polemic not only against the works of Weyer, but also against Weyer personally. For Baudin, witchcraft and pacts with the devil were real and could not be explained away as the product of a disturbed imaginatio. Both in the work itself and in the appendix, Baudin devotes considerable attention to the phenomenon of ecstasis, explicitly arguing that the devil can cause a separation between body and soul. The dispute between Baudin and Weyer was also noted in Wittenberg. Martin Biermann presided over the presided in the year 1593 over the disputation De Magicis Actionibus, in which he sided with Weyer. As the title of the 1613 edition shows, the disputation has already been printed 4 times, indicating its importance. Biermann's arguments fall into 2 main categories. Firstly, as we have already seen, he argues with the help of Aristotle that a separation between body and soul is impossible, and secondly, he opposes Baudin's view that ecstasy cannot be induced naturally by sleep-inducing drugs. Hieronymus Neumann went one step further. In his inaugural address, Oratio de Imaginatione, he explained ecstasy as either the influence of the devil or a form of melancholy that affects the imaginatio. The devil is no longer necessary. Natural causes are sufficient. Daniel Sennett, on the other hand, makes a stronger distinction between natural ecstasy, which he sees as a kind of sleep, during which various phantasmata are created, and a variant induced by demons, the mechanism of which he does not explain in detail. With regard to the so-called sopor daemoniacus, the demonic sleep of witches, that means witches fall asleep and then visit the Sabbath. With regard to so-called sopor daemoniacus, the demonic sleep of witches, he writes that the fact that so many different witches from all regions report the same things point to the work of the devil, and therefore it cannot be a natural form of ecstasy. So far, we can see that the Wittenberg explanations of the workings of ecstasy assume a combination of demons and imaginatio, although none of the authors would have ruled out either. Rather, they set different limits to what was natural in this respect, thus remaining within the contemporary framework, without, like Baudin, taking positions that were too extreme. Okay, let's end with a summary. In the first part, we examined the conditions of reception. It became clear that the reception of contemporary imaginatio concepts was well compatible with the Protestant understandings of anatomy. Reception was also facilitated by the fact that Aristotle's text, through its openness, laid the foundation for the use of imaginatio in the context of contemporary demonology. Especially in cases where the power of demons was thought to be very limited, the disruption of the imaginatio was an obvious explanatory model. In the Wittenberg discourse on ecstasy, demons were given narrow limits. Since a separation of body and soul was considered impossible, melancholy and demonic influence on the imaginatio were usually assumed to be the cause of the phenomenon of ecstasy. The imaginatio thus contributed to a rationalization of the discourse, especially in the works of Hieronymus Neumann, in which the demonic component no longer necessarily had to be present. On the whole, however, the discourse on ecstasy remains largely within the framework of tradition. Thank you for your audience.